here we go again. We come on the air this afternoon with breaking news again. In the last 15 minutes, we have learned that John Bolton, former national security advisor turned sharp critic of Donald Trump, is expected to be the subject of a complaint or even an indictment as early as next week. MSNBC, citing two sources, is reporting exclusively that the acting U.S. attorney in Maryland is moving forward quickly to seek criminal charges against Bolton. They reportedly relate to claims that he improperly kept classified national security information in his Maryland home. His home was searched in August. Bolton's lawyer insists that his client, John Bolton, did nothing improper. It is the second instance of targeting a prominent Trump critic in 2 days, and the third in the past 2 weeks. It certainly fuels the perception that Donald Trump is deliberately making his way down a to-do list having to do with his promise of political retribution. It is where we begin today with former Department of Justice pardon attorney Liz Oyer. She was fired by Trump's Justice Department in March. Also joining us, former Assistant Special Agent in charge at the FBI, MSNBC National Security and Intelligence Analyst Michael Feinberg. He's also a fellow at Lawfare. Also joining us, NYU law professor, MSNBC legal analyst Melissa Murray. And with me at the table, investigative reporter for the New York Times, Mike Schmidt is here. Michael Feinberg, I want to start with you because I think there will be a reflexive instinct to dive immediately into the facts, which is an important part of anything that all of us do. But I do think that the forest is perhaps more newsworthy at the moment. This is the third stated enemy of Donald Trump indicted in less than 2 weeks. There is clearly direction, and because Donald Trump mistakenly posted it on social media instead of in the DM where he planned to send it, according to reporting in the Wall Street Journal, that he wanted, quote, Pam to move quickly with his targeted enemies.
Yeah, that's very true. And I've heard from a couple of different sources that with respect to the Letitia James indictment, that the acting U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia did not even notify the Maine Justice Department that she was doing it this week. They were expecting it to happen next week. So that sort of at least implies she was communicating or taking orders from somebody other than her direct chain of command at DOJ. The alacrity with which the Bolton complaint or indictment is moving forward is also a little bit alarming, because normally in a case involving the mishandling of classified information, you have to do something called an original classification authority determination, where you take the supposedly classified information, you send it to the owning agency, and they make a determination about whether it is in fact classified. That is a process that usually takes months, and it is something beyond the control and outside of the Department of Justice's chain of command. So I don't see how they could have gotten that OCA classification without direct intervention from the White House ordering the other agencies to speed up the usual process.
That's a fascinating thing that certainly at least someone like yourself would be able to flag for us. I want to ask you about John Bolton's sort of arc as a national security figure. I worked in the Bush administration. He was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, politically a polarizing figure in both parties. He became a sharp critic of Donald Trump's, and that might be the most familiar that many of my viewers are with him. But in the middle, there was an effort by Bill Barr to prosecute him or to stop the publication of a book. And one of the things he wrote about in his book, called The Room Where It Happens, was the issue over which Donald Trump is indicted the first time, the pressure campaign against Zelensky. Just talk about his profile as someone who has this long story going back to Bill Barr of political retribution and malicious prosecution, if that's an argument his lawyers choose to make.
Yeah, well, I mean, John Bolton has had a very long and journeyed path within conservative foreign policy circles, starting out as some sort of a mid-period neoconservative in the Bush administration to his role in the Trump administration, where reportedly he often got into disagreements over the sort of America first isolationist posture that administration often took. And so he wrote his book, The Room Where It Happened, as a direct criticism of that point of view. And it was incredibly uncomplimentary to the president and many of his supporters. So, Bill Barr and the then DOJ began an investigation into whether he had inadvertently or purposely released classified information. And one of the things that came out during that tumult was that he had submitted the book to pre-publication review, as former government officials are required to do, and they approved it, but then that approval was somehow overruled by a different figure in the chain of command, and he was asked to resubmit it, and he resubmitted it and never got a response, supposedly, to the second submission. And ultimately, he and his publishers decided to release the book. And so Bill Barr launched an investigation. The investigation never really went anywhere, in that after the change in administrations, Merrick Garland and his Justice Department, who, it should be very clear, are not natural allies of John Bolton, determined that there had been no wrongdoing and this was not a charge worth pursuing. But I should hasten to add, we don't know for certain. In fact, we've heard reporting to the contrary, that these new charges have anything to do with the publication of that book.
And we'll dive into what we do know on the fact pattern of what he's expected to be indicted for next week. I see some of the instinct to separate this case out, and that will be important at one level. But the way that it's the same sounds to me like, as with Jim Comey, Bill Barr looked at Bolton and tried to prosecute him, and ultimately that case doesn't go as far as Trump wanted it to. And this Justice Department seems to be barreling full speed ahead. Mike Schmidt, this is a chapter you've written about and reported on extensively. Your thoughts?
The reason that we're having this conversation is that presidents are told in normal times, and Donald Trump was told this during his first term, that they should not talk about criminal investigations. They shouldn't talk about who should be criminally investigated and who committed criminality. Because if they do that, it creates a perception that the prosecution is being done at the behest of the president. And it raises the question, is this being done for political reasons, or is this being done based on the law and the fact? Obviously, Donald Trump has not kept his mouth shut about John Bolton. So because of that, we cannot sit here as people trying to understand this moment and accept on the face of it that this is being done based on the law and the fact, because the most powerful person in the United States, who has picked not only who his attorney general is, but it looks like picks, who his line prosecutors are on prosecutions, has been so open about this. And during his first term, aides and lawyers told him time and time again, don't talk about this, because when they really do get one of your enemies, it could potentially undermine it. So if he is charged and it does move forward, we will see, first of all, we'll get a sense of what the evidence is, and we will also see what is a question that has emerged in the Comey case, and I'm sure will emerge in the James case and will emerge in the Bolton case, which is, where is the line on vindictive prosecution? So a lot of people that get indicted go to court and they try and file motions and they say, I'm being unfairly prosecuted and I'm being persecuted for that. And those things usually fall flat. They usually do not get ruled on in their favor. We now have people that the President of the United States has openly said, I want prosecuted, and it looks like they are being prosecuted. And there's not a lot of case law on this. This is not something that we see play out a lot. So we're going to see what vindictive prosecution means in 2025 in the United States. Is that something that would stop a criminal prosecution, or is it something that it doesn't matter to the courts?
MSNBC reporting a Maryland grand jury has been now hearing evidence, what has been for weeks, but breaking tonight is we know about it. And they are building, apparently, a case that is against a Trump perceived enemy and yet one who worked for President Trump, longtime neoconservative foreign policy voice John Bolton. Now, the suggestion is they are close to getting where they, the Trump DOJ officials, want, and they're trying to cook up this case to get a grand jury indictment, and that could come as soon as next week. The case has sped up. Bolton, of course, was the former national security advisor to President Trump, a top U.S. official. And since leaving office, while he is not a lefty going to No Kings protests, he has referred to what he learned in that time and his view, based on the evidence, about what Donald Trump is doing. You could put him in a category of more of a Mike Pence than a James Comey, one who served loyally to Donald Trump for years and was, of course, a longtime Republican, whose main offense, according to Donald Trump, is that he has referred to things that Trump is doing that are contrary to law or Bolton's view of sound policy. MSNBC reporting that the figure who is seen as Trump's retribution czar, Ed Martin, has been meeting with the acting U.S. attorney on the case. That itself is unusual. FBI agents did search Bolton's home in August. We know about that. That's been reported. And Trump, who has continued to vacillate between denying that he's in charge of these revenge prosecutions and then bragging or publicly suggesting that he can do whatever he wants. Well, here's what he said then.
No, I don't know about it. I saw it on television this morning. I know nothing about it. I just saw it this morning. They did a raid. I don't want to know about it. It's not necessary. I could know about it. I could be the one starting it. I'm actually the chief law enforcement officer. But I feel that it's better this way.
That's the president's sort of public description, balancing what everyone knows, which is that he has been vowing these type of revenge prosecutions. But even Donald Trump also has understood and even learned in the first term about where the limits might be, and that you don't necessarily want to admit that you're building revenge political cases that turn on the people rather than the criminal evidence, if there is any. And if it seems like we're ending the week with more news about Donald Trump on a tear, that's because we are. If you're trying to keep it straight or you've been busy and not following every domino, just this week, the DOJ indicted the top law enforcement official in New York, Attorney General Letitia James, who had previously run a civil case, no threat of jail time there, but a civil enforcement action against Trump Org. So now the DOJ has taken formal legal steps using the criminal investigative powers it has against 6 people that Donald Trump perceives as foes. You have the indictments, you have the grand jury going forward on Bolton, you have a subpoena for another individual who did oversee a case against Trump, D.A. Willis. You have the charges, remember, against the New Jersey mayor, which were so weak they were dropped, that case never going to trial. And you have Democratic Congressman McIver, who we heard from on this very program this week. So it's adding up. James and Comey have said they are innocent, and this is no time to be scared.
This is nothing more than a continuation of the president's desperate weaponization of our justice system. He is forcing federal law enforcement agencies to do his bidding, all because I did my job.
There are costs to standing up to Donald Trump, but we couldn't imagine ourselves living any other way. We will not live on our knees.
Mr. Comey, who has proven controversial for a range of reasons, striking a note that now may be heard by other Trump allies or former allies like John Bolton, that when you face this kind of crackdown, this kind of alleged selective prosecution, that's one of the arguments they're making to try to get these cases tossed, you have to be strong, not fearful. And for those who think that the president might have stopped just at Comey or just at a Democrat in New York, well, tonight's reporting that he is moving quickly through his DOJ to go at someone who worked in the highest levels of the White House for Donald Trump shows that no one appears to be safe, and that may be exactly the message this president wants to send. Jason, I want to go to you first based on our understanding of what's happening, that this is more of a story about politics or politics infusing the DOJ to a degree that might be unlawful, rather than a traditional legal story, although Emily, I'm sure, will give us some legal analysis on the strength of these cases. Do you, I guess, Jason, agree with that premise? And what do you see here happening politically as Donald Trump is sending a message clearly across the bow, even to his own former aides, John Bolton, the longtime neocon Republican?
All right, I don't know why anybody should be surprised. I mean, Donald Trump has never been loyal to anyone. He has a list of people that he has taken advantage of, a list of people he's lied to. I mean, he did nothing when people were threatening to kill his vice president. So I don't know why anyone is surprised that a president who said that I'm going to go on revenge is going on revenge. I think the only saving grace here is that while Donald Trump and some of his acolytes, they think he's Tony Soprano, he's more like my cousin Vinny. Most of these cases don't work. They fall apart fairly quickly. He ends up looking foolish. But the threat of going after these people and making them have to spend money to defend themselves is part of how he's establishing the sort of authoritarian bully pulpit that he's been pushing for since he got back into office.
Let's put the president to the side for a moment, however he might feel about that. And just remember, John Bolton, who worked in the Bush administration and is a longtime conservative Republican, this is who he is. Take a look.
I don't think he's fit for office. I don't think he has the competence to carry out the job. There really isn't any guiding principle that I was able to discern other than what's good for Donald Trump's reelection. What he was capable of was on a daily basis doing something more and more outrageous than he had done the day before, all to the same end of staying in power. I think when you challenge the Constitution itself the way Trump has done, that is un-American.
Do you agree with Mark Milley that Trump is a fascist?
You know, I don't think he's smart enough to have an ideology.
Mr. Bolton's criticisms have to do with what he learned about Donald Trump having worked for him. He himself is a longtime conservative. And so it would appear that is the fault line, not foreign policy, national security, the things he actually worked on with Trump. All Trump heard was that.
Right, all right. And here's the thing.
That's true.
As he pointed out.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll go to Jason and then
sorry.
Emily. That's my bad.
Yeah, the only criteria seems to be whoever is in Donald Trump's burn book that week. And clearly, whether you have problems with him politically or ideologically, I mean, the toughest thing Bolton said is this guy isn't smart enough to be a fascist. I mean, that's a pretty serious insult. But at the end of the day, whether it's Comey or Tish James or anyone else that he has threatened, Donald Trump doesn't care if that person has broken the law. Donald Trump doesn't care if that person has stood in the way of policy. If he just personally dislikes you, he's going to weaponize the entire government. And that is a danger for everyone, not just in his own party, but every American citizen.
Emily?
You know, one of the most striking features of the Trump administration so far has been how few Republicans have been willing to speak out on the record, right? I mean, almost no one in Congress has been willing to criticize Trump, except maybe about Jimmy Kimmel a little bit. And so Bolton stands out there as this former Trump official who's willing to go on television and say these critical things. How better to send a message that this is a risky thing to do than to go to a grand jury and ask for an indictment?
Yeah. Emily, this is what Bolton said when it came up that these threats were looming.
You're obviously on his enemies list, at least Kash Patel's enemies list. Are you worried that they're going to come after you in some way? I mean, he's hinted at it before.
Well, I think he's already come after me and several others in withdrawing the protection that we had for from the Iranians for the attack on Qasem Soleimani. So I think, and I said in the new forward to the paperback edition of my book, I think it is a retribution presidency.
Emily?
Right. And Bolton is a good vehicle for sending a message to other Republicans about the problem of being on this enemies list, which, you know, it looks like the Justice Department is kind of ticking through. We should also say that when Bolton's home was searched, there were some reports from the Biden Justice Department or former officials that they had also been looking at this question of whether Bolton had classified information. So, you know, it's possible there will be more to this case. We don't know yet. But you look at how flimsy and weak the evidence appears to be against Letitia James and James Comey, and there is, you know, a lot to wonder about here. in those cases, we know that prosecutors who were instructed to investigate, basically told it would be really good for them to find something, they passed on those cases. You know, former acting U.S. Attorney in Virginia, Eric Siebert, he was forced to resign rather than go ahead with those prosecutions. So those cases, it just seems really stark what we know about them. I think it's a little less clear at this point about the case against Bolton. And obviously, if there is an indictment from the grand jury, we'll know a little bit more.
We'll look at the faces, as you mentioned, Emily, because you're saying there's the larger pattern. Any individual case can be sort of debated, but when you see all these up, you have this strong pattern. As I mentioned, the case against the mayor was so weak it fell apart, but they wanted to charge it. And in the still pending McIver case, the video evidence shows federal officials saying, turn off your body cameras, which is suspicious. They didn't want a record. And this comes at the order of the deputy attorney general themselves, who was a former Trump defense attorney. All of that is bad for those cases. What you're saying with Bolton, lower left grand jury there, for folks looking at all the cases, Emily, is that apart from this pattern, if they have this kind of evidence and these documents cases come down to where the classified material is, you're saying that they might have, separate from the pattern, some more evidence to go on. I mean, Emily, folks remember the president himself was previously brought up on a documents case, although there was a lot of obstruction evidence and evidence that he clearly knew he had him and wouldn't give him back. But you're saying if the right documents are there, that strengthens the DOJ's hand?
I mean, I'm speculating because we don't know yet. And I find the speculating to be frustrating because also we're sort of focusing on what Trump wants us to focus on, which is whether there's any wrongdoing here from John Bolton, as opposed to this pattern in the Justice Department. We are obviously also talking about that. But I find this part of the process frustrating because people get accused and then we spend time sifting through the accusations. We're supposed to do that. But in the end, if the cases fall apart, then all of that is wounding to their reputations. Yeah. No good reason.
Joining us now, MSNBC Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian, former Assistant Attorney General who led the Justice Department's Criminal Division, Leslie Caldwell, former advisor to George W. Bush and John McCain, and creator of The Circus, Mark McKinnon, and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General and former lawyer for George W. Bush, Tom Dupree. An ignominious list indeed, Ken. Why is Ty Cobb saying Pam Bondi should be at the top of it?
Well, you know what's so interesting about that clip you just played, Katie, is that those indictments were handed down during the Nixon administration. Richard Nixon was still president. He didn't resign until August. And it just shows you what a different world we're living in right now, because even then, even as he was trying to preserve his viability and stay in office, he knew, because there was still a sense of shame in politics and there was still a public opinion, sort of one truth that people who watched the nightly news agreed to. He knew that he had to satisfy the public. There clearly was a scandal. People clearly committed misconduct. And so the Justice Department was indicting these people. That would never happen in the Trump administration. It's very clear because we have, for example, evidence that Tom Homan and the Borders Czar accepted $50,000 in cash. There was a bribery investigation. That investigation is gone now. No one I talked to inside the FBI or the DOJ could imagine any kind of charge of misconduct or corruption being brought by this Justice Department against currently serving officials in the Trump administration. So in a sense, this is a much worse situation than we found ourselves with John Mitchell and in Watergate, because even then there was some distance between Richard Nixon and the FBI, Richard Nixon and the DOJ. There is no distance right now. The White House is clearly calling the shots. They're deciding who gets prosecuted and who doesn't get prosecuted. And Pam Bondi is a cheerleader for the president, going on, standing in front of the Senate and defending everything he does and lobbing personal attacks at senators who ask her basic oversight questions. So that's why Ty Cobb made that point, and it's actually arguably worse than back then.
Tom, do you agree?
Well, I would say that the judgment of history, I think, will show that Pam Bondi broke from the tradition of her predecessors in not trusting the judgment of career prosecutors and deciding who to charge and following and accepting directives from the president. All of that is fairly unusual, if not unique, in our nation's history. I think that one thing we have seen in this Justice Department, and this is, consistent from day one, is that there's been a total repudiation of the norms that have governed prior Justice Departments in terms of the separation of the prosecutorial function from the White House, in terms of, an interest in pursuing the president's political opponents, that sort of thing. So we are in totally different territory. I was somewhat amused to see Alberto Gonzales, my former boss, up there with other attorney generals, who was up there because he had fired several U.S. attorneys for political reasons, which today in this world seems almost a quaint reason for criticizing him, but that's where we are today.
Yeah, and we've done a whole show where we highlighted those firings and the reaction to it, and George W. Bush trying to explain it and what a scandal it was in the moment and how it compares to now, which, as you said, is quaint. Leslie, let's talk about the charges here against Letitia James. Are these charges that you would have brought?
Based on what I know about the case, absolutely not. There are two components to deciding whether to charge a case as a prosecutor. One is, what's your evidence, and are you likely to be able to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt? And the second component is prosecutorial discretion. So should you bring this case? This is a case that alleges a very small bank fraud. If it's assuming that it's alleged correctly, which I'm not assuming, that at worst there was a very insignificant bank fraud that nobody really lost any money from. According to the indictment, Letitia James just avoided having to pay about $18,000+ over the entire life of the loan. That case would not be brought. Really.
Why not?
Because it's too insignificant, and prosecutors have limited resources. And if you're spending your time on an $18,000 bank fraud case, you don't have your time or your resources to spend on the $180 million bank fraud cases, of which there are plenty.
She alleges in her own paperwork that there are emails, there's other documents that say that she was very clear about this not being a primary residence.
Yes, I've seen those.
Does that pose a problem?
I think it poses a huge problem because although this indictment on its face, not knowing who she is or all the noise that surrounded it, looks more like a normal indictment than the Comey indictment, for example. But I think that.
What do you mean more normal than the Comey indictment?
It lays out some background information, and it lays out the conduct that she supposedly engaged in more detail. It's by no means a lengthy indictment, obviously, but it's easier to glean what the actual accusations are than in the Comey indictment.
I'm curious, and I'm not expecting you to have these facts at your hand, but I would love to have somebody to research just how many times in our history anybody's been indicted for this level of fraud in the Justice Department.
I think you know a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would bet that the answer would be never. But I don't know that for sure. I could see a scenario where somebody's indicted for a more serious crime or another crime, and this might be thrown in as an additional count. Let's say there's a big financial fraud, and they would add, you knew about this also, so you might throw this in. But in a case where it seems like, I think we would have heard if this is not the case, the mortgage payments are being made. She said that it was not her permanent residence. She also said that, contrary to what's been discussed about the indictment, she didn't say she was renting it to any stranger. Her niece would be living there, and she expressly told the mortgage originator that.
It looks like a miniature version of the indictment and the case against Donald Trump and the mortgage fraud that she accused him and got a sizable judgment against him for. That judgment was diminished significantly, but at the time there was a question about whether the case should go forward among critics, saying that the harm wasn't there. The banks weren't upset, they didn't lose money, that nobody was harmed. So to bring this case against Donald Trump, the accusation was from critics and even from people who didn't like Donald Trump but were worried that this was not a case that should be brought, that it was something that felt a little politically motivated on Tish James's part. This is the criticism, especially because she ran on going after Trump. So there are people that are going to argue tit for tat. I'm not saying it makes it okay, but they're going to make that argument.
Sure, and I think that's a fair criticism. But on the other hand, if that's the criticism, and that was your criticism if you're Donald Trump at the time, is the way to handle that to do the same exact thing once you're in office?
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also you used the word mini. I mean, this is more like micro.
Well, and also, isn't there in some sort of criminal intent as part of it?
Yes, I mean, they would have to prove
to defraud.
They would have to prove that she knew she was not telling the truth and she was making the false statement for the purpose of benefiting, I guess, from a lower mortgage rate, and that she intended to do that. And I think that would be, those cases are always hard, but I think that plus the political aura makes.
Let's go back to the big picture here, because I think that is important. And Ken, you laid it out so well. I mean, you mentioned Tom Homan not being prosecuted, the investigation being dropped, even though there was that reporting that you've done about the $50,000 bribe. We haven't gotten any answers on that regarding whether he still has that cash, right?
That's correct. And Pam Bondi was asked several times under oath in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee that very question and other questions about that investigation. She refused to answer any of them, even though this is a closed case. And so she could certainly talk about some aspects of it, especially because no charges were filed. As far as I know, it never went before a grand jury. This was just a series of investigative steps taken by the FBI. So we don't know, where is the money? Did Tom Homan keep, this was taxpayer money after all. Did he pay taxes on it as income? We don't have answers to that those questions. Pam Bondi is declining to answer them. She's also declining to release any of the records and the documents that might shed some light on that.
So, Tom, what might you be worried that DOJ is not going after right now?
Well, the concern is that they're doing what President Trump, repeatedly said on the campaign trail the Biden administration was doing, which is to say weaponizing the Justice Department to punish the enemies and reward the friends. And so that would be the concern, that, within the Justice Department, that there are people who look at these evidentiary records and say this warrants bringing charges against Tish James, where there are other individuals who potentially could be subject to charges, and they say, we're not going to bring those charges. Look, I think from the Trump administration's perspective, the best way that you can portray the indictment of Tish James is to say that it serves the interests of cosmic justice, that Tish James campaigned on a platform of going after President Trump. She brought charges based on real estate fraud, based on alleged false statements and loan documents that enabled him to get a better rate. And he has done the exact same thing to her, albeit, I totally agree, on a vastly, vastly smaller scale. But I think that's really the only way you can legitimize this indictment. If you look at this through the lens of a cynical prosecutor, you say this is a weak case. It's not one the Justice Department would normally bring. But again, if you're defending the indictment, you say it serves the interest of cosmic justice and that it does exactly to Tish James what she did to President Trump.
How much cosmic justice are we going to be in for, though? I mean, you have Tish James, you have James Comey, Adam Schiff is preparing himself. We have that whole list that we just put up in a graphic right there. Fani Willis, anybody who went after Donald Trump or went after the actions that he undertook in the aftermath of trying to claim the election was stolen when it was not, or people who tried to shed light on what his White House was like, including John Bolton or Christopher Krebs saying the election was free and it was fair and it was safe and secure. I mean, all of these people, cosmic justice for telling the truth in some of these cases?
Yeah, and you know it's an endless list. I mean, where would it end with Donald Trump? And so I think the Department of Justice is going to be awfully busy just taking care of its retribution list.
How do they want to be doing that? I mean, are you going to see more career prosecutors quit or?
I think, yes, I do think a lot of people are going to quit if this continues, and many have already quit and are or have their resumes out.
So what happens to DOJ in the future?
Well, that's going to be the million-dollar question, right? Does DOJ ever get back to being an integrity-driven, evidence and fact-driven, law-driven organization, or is it just going to become a political arm of the White House?
Can we go back to the Tom Homan situation?
Sure.
Just like your view on that and how that all went down, and just from a DOJ perspective from your chair.
So all I know, obviously, is what I've seen and reported. But if he actually took the money, I haven't obviously listened to the tapes that the FBI agents apparently made, so I don't know if there's something on there like, if Trump gets reelected, I'll help you with X, Y, or Z contracts. So I don't know the evidence, but certainly taking the money itself is something that is completely inappropriate.
Why is there not a clear answer of whether he has it?
So I think I haven't heard a justification because I don't think that the department has given one by why they're not talking about this. But I think they could fall back on no case was brought. This was subject to confidentiality, and there's no reason to discuss it now since the case is closed.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. This week, we've been watching protests gather across the country, large and small, planned and impromptu. We saw a massive crowd march through Chicago this week. We covered it live on the air here, against the escalating lawlessness there by masked federal agents. Tonight, there was a growing crowd in New York to protest the indictment of State Attorney General Letitia James on direct orders from Donald Trump. More and bigger protests are coming because millions of Americans are appalled with the direction the country is going in, and they refuse to be silenced as their communities are being torn apart. And that explains the incredibly dishonest and downright dangerous new talking point being pushed by MAGA. Republicans on Capitol Hill are claiming that peaceful protesters are part of a terrorist network hell-bent on destroying America, and that Democrats shut down the government Republicans control, to do the bidding of these evil, violent leftists. This was House Speaker Mike Johnson on Fox.
The theory we have right now, they have a Hate America rally that's scheduled for October 18th on the National Mall. It's all the pro-Hamas wing and the Antifa people. They're all coming out. Some of the House Democrats are selling T-shirts for the event, and it's being told to us that they won't be able to reopen the government until after that rally.
The pro-Hamas wing, the Antifa people. Here was Republican Senator Roger Marshall at almost the exact same time on Newsmax.
October 18th is when the protest gets here. This will be a Soros paid-for protest where his professional protesters show up, the agitators show up. We'll have to get the National Guard out. Hopefully it'll be peaceful. I doubt it.
You doubt it? The National Guard's going to come out? A Soros paid-for protest. I doubt it will be peaceful. By mid-morning, Republican leaders were pushing these lies out to the national media.
And as the speaker pointed out this morning, one of the other things that's being reported now is that one of the dates it looks like they're holding the government hostage over is the 18th of the month, where they're having this Hate America rally in Washington. And Democrats want to keep the government shut down to show all of those people that are going to come here and express their hatred towards this country that they're fighting President Trump.
This is about one thing and one thing only: to score political points with the terrorist wing of their party, which is set to hold, as Leader Scalise just commented on, a Hate America rally in D.C. next week.
I mean, really, guys? Really? The terrorist wing of the party? A Hate America rally? There is a very large peaceful protest that is planned for October 18th. By the way, I don't think the Democrats have any relationship to whether they're holding the government hostage over it. It's completely one has nothing to do with the other. That protest is not going to just be in Washington, but it's going to be in thousands of communities across the country. Now, I'm going to tell you something. It's not called a Hate America protest. They couldn't actually say the name of the protest because it would be so obviously American in its name. It is the No Kings protest. No Kings being a value, I think, that unites all of us as Americans. Republicans are trying to paint this as some kind of reverse January 6th plot by leftist terrorists. But it's a lie. It's a despicable lie, honestly, and a dangerous one, because there was already a No Kings protest earlier this year. Remember? We both lived through it. It's not that long ago. You might have even been there if you're listening to this right now. I covered it live at this desk, along with the other estimated 5 million Americans who were there, of every background and age, and they marched, and they danced, and they sang, and they carried signs, some of them snarky, some of them quite funny, all across the country, in more than 2,000 cities and towns. It was held on June 14th, Flag Day. It even outdrew Donald Trump's birthday parade of army tanks that same day. Remember that? So, when all those MAGA Republicans went out in advance of the protest to try to criminalize protected political activity, the organizers of the upcoming No Kings rally responded, quote, "After a few moments of laughter, the No Kings coalition issued the following statement. Speaker Johnson is running out of excuses for keeping the government shut down. Instead of reopening the government, preserving affordable health care, or lowering costs for working families, he's attacking millions of Americans who are peacefully coming together to say that America belongs to its people, not to kings. We'll see everyone on October 18th. The group reaffirmed its commitment to nonviolence and said its organizers were trained in de-escalation. Republicans, led by the Speaker of the House, are telling the public that a peaceful demonstration on the National Mall, again, we already had one, right? This isn't just a thought experiment. We had a big one in June. they're planning another one, that this will actually be a gathering of organizations the administration has formally designated in an executive order as violent terrorists. And again, it's preposterous and comical at one level, but again, this is incendiary and incredibly dangerous. But that's the point. They understand these protests are powerful. They are trying to intimidate people from turning out with lies and conspiracy theories. Just as officials like Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem have churned out government propaganda videos and media interviews where, again, they're trying to pull off this lame Jedi mind trick where they just tell us that we're not seeing what we're seeing. This totally alternate reality, totally untethered, to delude people into believing cities like Portland and Chicago are war-torn hellholes. When even Noem is being met, oh, there they are. Oh my God, there they are. The guy in the chicken suit. Polite crowd of protesters, some people in frogs and capybara costumes, and unicorns. That's what's going on. Of course, there are protests around the world and around the country. In Portland, Chicago, we're seeing regular people standing up for their neighbors. We're seeing people protest in the face of more footage of escalating abuses. Again, that is the precipitating incident in all this, right? Abuses by masked federal agents acting on Trump's orders.
What's your name?
Debbie Brockman, I work for WGN. Let them know.
I got you. Yep. Debbie Browning?
Brockman.
Brockman, WGN.
Proud of yourself.
Do you guys want to share your names too, or you're just going to cover your face?
Now, that woman there is Debbie Brockman. She is an employee of WGN TV in Chicago, the network. She's being forced to the ground and cuffed by not one, not two, but three agents. DHS says they arrested her today for allegedly assaulting a federal agent, that she was throwing things at them while she was out reporting. WGN says she was not charged with any crimes and was released, so we're going to let you decide whether DHS's official statement about her arrest was truthful. Despite the dangers, bystanders documented her initial arrest and confronted the agents without impeding them or escalating.
A little out of breath today, huh, fellas?
Super good at your jobs, aren't you? Super f***ing good at your jobs.
Take the mask down.
Mask down.
Oh, you guys get that?
This exact dynamic in the face of government force is spreading everywhere. Ask Kevin Stitt, that's the Republican governor of Oklahoma, who happens to be the chair of the National Governors Association, who, to his real credit, blasted Trump's attempted deployment of Texas National Guard soldiers to Chicago this week. Quote, "We believe in the federalist system. That's states' rights. Oklahomans would lose their mind if Pritzker in Illinois sent troops down to Oklahoma during the Biden administration." A statement irrefutably true, and we all know it. And then just a few hours ago, a federal judge blocked that planned Guard deployment in Chicago, criticizing the government's lawyers for, quote, equating protests with riots and a lack of appreciation for the wide spectrum that exists between citizens who are observing, questioning, and criticizing their government and those who are obstructing, assaulting, or doing violence. At this point, it seems clear to me that Trump and the MAGA cronies know there are likely to be millions of people in the streets on October 18th for those No Kings protests. And so their strategy is to preemptively paint patriotic, dissenting Americans as literal terrorists. And if there was ever a time to exercise this right to protest, a right enshrined in the very First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, it is now.